In the quiet, mist-veiled neighborhood of Tiburon, California, where the bay kisses the edges of rolling hills, there stands a house once owned by the legendary Robin Williams. A home filled with laughter, creativity, and warmth. Now, it is known for something else entirely. The new owners, Mark and Elaine Porter, a couple from Seattle, had been drawn to the property not because of its history, but because of its beauty. A Mediterranean-style villa with arched windows that opened to breathtaking views of the water. The house felt like a dream. They were aware of its previous owner, of course. It was impossible not to be. But they never imagined that Robin Williams' presence might still linger within its walls. At first, it was small things, a book shifting slightly on the shelf, faint murmurs in the hallway when no one else was home. Mark, a pragmatic software engineer, dismissed it as the natural creaks and groans of an old house settling. Elaine, an artist with a more intuitive nature, wasn't so sure. Then came the laughter. One night, as Elaine stood by the kitchen window gazing at the bay, she heard it soft, warm, unmistakably familiar. A chuckle, light-hearted yet tinged with sadness, echoing through the empty living room. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. The television was off. Mark was upstairs. The house stood still, but the laughter remained, floating in the air like a memory unwilling to fade. As weeks passed, the occurrences grew stranger. The couple would wake to find lights turned on in rooms they hadn't entered, music playing from an old stereo system they never used. More than once, they found the grand piano in the living room with its lid open, as if someone had been playing it in the dead of night. Mark remained skeptical until the night he saw the figure. It was past midnight when he walked into the study and caught a glimpse of something, a silhouette near the bookshelf. Its head bowed, shoulders hunched forward in a posture eerily familiar. As soon as Mark stepped closer, the figure was gone. But a lingering sense of sadness filled the room, an unshakable melancholy that weighed on his chest. Determined to make sense of it all, Elaine began researching paranormal activity and even spoke to a medium. The woman, a local with a reputation for sensitivity to spirits, agreed to visit. As soon as she stepped inside, she whispered, "He's still here." During a séance, the energy in the room became heavy, the air charged with something unseen but deeply felt. A presence neither malicious nor trapped, but lonely. The medium described a soul not looking to scare or harm, but simply reluctant to leave a place where joy and sorrow had intertwined so deeply. Mark and Elaine, instead of fearing their spectral guest, chose to honor him. They left the stereo untouched, allowing jazz music to play softly in the evenings. They kept the bookshelf as it was, resisting the urge to rearrange the volumes. And occasionally, when the house was quiet, they swore they could still hear that unmistakable laughter, gentle, nostalgic, and fleeting, like a whisper from the past. Perhaps Robin Williams had left this world, but in the house he once called home, a part of him remained, reminding the living that even in the echoes of sorrow, there is room for light. The air inside the house had changed. It was not something tangible, not something one could touch or measure, but Elaine felt it like a shift in temperature, like the way the atmosphere grows dense before a storm. The house breathed with a presence not oppressive, not dark, but lingering, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of memory. Late at night, when the bay was still and the world outside seemed to shrink into the glow of streetlights and distant boats, Elaine would sit in the living room with a book in her hands, pretending to read. She wasn't. She was listening. The soft creak of a floorboard upstairs, the almost imperceptible sigh of movement just beyond the edge of sight. Mark had learned to ignore it, but Elaine was unable to. She felt as though the house itself was speaking, though in whispers too faint to fully understand. One evening, as the last strokes of orange faded from the sky, she decided to test a theory. She placed an old notebook on the coffee table and left a pen beside it. Nothing dramatic, no candles, no elaborate invitations to the unseen, just an open page waiting. She did not tell Mark. He had grown weary of the topic, brushing off the strange happenings as tricks of the mind. The next morning, she woke to find the notebook exactly as she had left it. No words scrawled across the page, no signs of disturbance. But as she reached for it, she noticed something, a single pen stroke, faint and hesitant, near the edge of the paper. It wasn't writing. It wasn't a message. But it was movement. That night, sleep did not come easily. The house felt awake, and Elaine, lying in bed with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, felt as though she was being watched, not with malice, not with intent, but with curiosity. She turned to look at Mark, who was lost in sleep, his breath slow and steady. Outside the bedroom door, the faintest sound of laughter drifted through the hallway, brief, subdued, and unmistakable. The next morning, Elaine finally told Mark about the notebook. He listened, rubbing a hand over his face, eyes heavy with sleep. "It was probably you," he murmured, but there was no conviction in his voice. Days passed, then weeks. The laughter came and went, unpredictable and sudden, like a memory replaying itself at odd intervals. Sometimes, it was accompanied by music, the soft strains of piano notes floating through the house when neither of them had touched the instrument. Mark tried to dismiss it. Elaine could not. And then, on a quiet Thursday evening, something changed. Elaine was alone, painting in the small studio she had set up in one of the upstairs rooms. The house was silent except for the soft scratch of her brush against the canvas, the rhythmic strokes calming, meditative. And then, just as she stepped back to look at her work, she heard it. A voice. Soft, low, familiar. It wasn't words, not entirely. Just the hint of a phrase, the ghost of a sentence spoken just beneath the threshold of clarity. Her heart pounded as she turned, expecting, hoping, to see something, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the room, the unfinished painting, the faint scent of turpentine in the air. But Elaine knew. The house was not empty. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The silence of the house was different now, charged, expectant, like the hush of a theater just before the curtains rise. Elaine found herself listening even when there was nothing to hear, watching even when the room was still. It was not fear that gripped her, but something stranger, something deeper. A feeling that she was being let in on a secret, an unspoken invitation into a world just beyond reach. Days passed in a slow unraveling of the ordinary. The house did not demand attention, but it gave her signs, small, fleeting things that could have been dismissed as tricks of the mind but weren't. The piano, closed in the morning, would sometimes be open at night. The old stereo, untouched for weeks, would hum to life for just a second, a whisper of music before falling silent again. One evening, as twilight bled into the horizon and the bay swallowed the last of the sun's glow, Elaine sat alone in the living room, absently turning pages in a book she wasn't reading. Mark had gone out, leaving her with the quiet, and in that quiet, she felt it again, the weight of presence, the unmistakable sense of being watched. Not from a single point, not from a shadowed corner or an open doorway, but from everywhere at once, as if the very walls of the house had eyes. She exhaled slowly. "Are you here?" she whispered. The house did not answer, not in words, but the lamp beside her flickered, just once, a brief pulse of light before settling back into stillness. Elaine swallowed, her pulse quickening. "I don't want to disturb you," she continued, feeling foolish, feeling bold. I just want to understand." Silence, and then laughter, soft, breathless. A sound carried not from another room, but from everywhere, all at once. It was distant yet near, warm yet aching. A laughter not meant for her but existing all the same, looping in the air like the remnants of an old conversation. Elaine's breath hitched. She knew that laugh. Her mind raced, grasping at possibilities. Maybe it was memory playing tricks on her. Maybe it was an echo of something that had once lived in the house, something imprinted so deeply into the walls that it had refused to fade. Or maybe it was him. The thought sent a chill through her, not fear, but awe, a strange and quiet reverence. Elaine closed her book and stood, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she might startle whatever invisible force lingered in the room. She turned toward the piano, its polished surface catching the dim glow of the lamp, stood silent, waiting. She hesitated. Then, with slow and careful steps, she approached, lowering herself onto the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain, before pressing down, coaxing a single note from the instrument. The sound rang out, pure and delicate. For a moment, there was nothing, just her own breath, the soft hum of the house settling. And then another note, not hers. Elaine froze. The key beside her own had pressed down, sound blossoming into the room, gentle and sure. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Her fingers trembled, but she did not pull away. Instead, she pressed another key. A pause. And then, in response, another. The duet was simple, hesitant. A conversation without words, a language spoken through sound. Elaine swallowed the lump in her throat. She knew she should be afraid, but she wasn't. The air around her was warm, humming, filled with something indescribable. She played another note, and this time the response came not as sound, but as laughter. Low, soft, familiar, and impossibly, undeniably real. The laughter lingered, dissolving into the air like the last notes of a fading melody. Elaine remained seated at the piano, her hands resting lightly on the keys, her heart pounding with the weight of something she could not name. The room around her felt alive, not in a way that could be seen or touched, but in a way that pressed against her skin, electric and weightless, a presence felt in the bones. She inhaled, slow and measured, as if breathing too quickly might break whatever fragile thread had been woven between her and the unseen. The house exhaled with her. Elaine lifted her hands from the keys and turned her head slightly, as though she might catch something in her peripheral vision, some fleeting movement, a shift in the air. The room was still but not empty. Never empty. A thought settled into her mind, quiet but persistent. She had not been the one to seek out whatever spirit lingered in this house. She had not performed seances or called out to the beyond. No, it had been the opposite. He had reached for her. She rose slowly from the bench, her fingertips trailing along the polished wood as she stepped away. The house did not resist her movement, did not shudder or groan in protest. It simply watched. The rest of the night passed in a haze. Mark returned late, his presence grounding, solid. He kissed her absent-mindedly on the forehead, oblivious to the weight of the air around them. She almost told him, almost whispered the words, "I played a duet tonight, but not alone." But she didn't. Not yet. Days turned into weeks, and the house remained patient. The occurrences did not stop, but neither did they intensify. It was as if whoever lived here, was content with simply existing alongside them. A presence neither malevolent nor restless, but curious. Elaine no longer startled at the occasional flicker of lights or the distant hum of music from the old stereo. She did not flinch when she passed by the bookshelf and found a book pulled slightly from its place, as though someone had considered reading it but changed their mind. One evening, as she stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, the stereo clicked on again. It wasn't random static this time. It wasn't a fragment of an old radio signal. It was a voice. His voice. Elaine's breath caught, the knife stilling in her hand as the unmistakable warmth of Robin Williams' laughter filled the room, not an echo, not a phantom chuckle, but recorded, real. It was an interview, one she recognized but could not immediately place. His voice tumbled from the speakers in that signature cadence, playful yet thoughtful, a rhythm all its own. "You gotta laugh, you know? You have to. Otherwise, the world just gets too damn heavy." The stereo clicked off. Elaine turned, her pulse drumming in her ears. The room was silent once more. The house had spoken, and now it waited. She set the knife down carefully, wiping her hands on a dish towel before stepping toward the stereo. It was old, outdated even, something they had intended to replace but never got around to. She reached out and brushed her fingers against the buttons. The surface was cool beneath her touch, lifeless, but she knew better now. Elaine exhaled, her voice quiet, steady. "I hear you." For a long moment, nothing. Then, so faintly she almost missed it, a sigh. Not from the stereo, not from outside, from the room itself. Elaine swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house was breathing again. Elaine did not move for a long time. She stood there, the scent of fresh-cut vegetables still sharp in the air, the weight of the house pressing gently around her like an unseen current. The sigh soft, barely more than a breath, had dissolved into silence, but the feeling it left behind had not. She closed her eyes. She listened. The house was waiting. A shiver crawled along her spine, not from fear, but from understanding. There was no malice here, no cold, grasping fingers from the dark. There was only the presence, gentle, patient, watching from just beyond the veil. The stereo remained still. No more sudden bursts of sound, no more phantom laughter rolling through the hallways. But Elaine knew with every quiet inch of herself that he was still there. And he wanted something. The following nights passed in a slow, expectant hush. The air within the house felt heavier, like a room just before a thunderstorm, thick with something unseen. Elaine found herself more attuned to it now, the subtle shifts, the brief flickers at the edge of her vision, the faint rustling of movement in an otherwise empty room. She had stopped questioning whether it was real. The moment the piano had answered her touch, the moment the stereo had chosen to speak, she had surrendered to the truth. The house was not empty. She told no one, not even Mark. He had stopped acknowledging the strange happenings, dismissing them with the casual indifference of someone unwilling to entertain the impossible. But Elaine had seen the way he lingered in doorways now, the way his gaze flickered toward darkened hallways, the way his hand hesitated just slightly before flipping off a light switch at night. He felt it too. He just wasn't ready to say it. It was nearly 3 in the morning when Elaine awoke to the sound of movement. Soft, shuffling, a slow step against hardwood. Her eyes opened in the darkness, her body frozen in the kind of stillness that comes only in moments of profound awareness. She turned her head toward the bedroom door. It was open. A shadow stretched across the hallway floor, long, unfamiliar. Elaine swallowed, pulse hammering against her ribs. She sat up, careful, deliberate, listening for the sound again. Nothing. The shadow did not move. The hallway light was off, but something was there, something standing just beyond the threshold, watching. Her breath came in short, quiet pulls as she forced herself to rise. The floor was cold beneath her bare feet. She stepped forward, inch by inch, until she reached the doorway. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with something unseen. She turned, slowly, her pulse thrumming in her ears. And that was when she saw it. A light, soft, pale, like the glow of a television left on in another room. It was coming from downstairs. Elaine's throat tightened. The living room. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe as she gathered herself, then stepped forward. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her weight, each step a whisper in the silence. The glow grew stronger as she descended, casting faint, shifting shadows against the walls. And then, as she reached the bottom step, she saw it. The television. It was on. But there was no static, no news anchors murmuring through the screen. There was only him, Robin Williams. It was an old interview, one she recognized but could not immediately place. The screen flickered slightly, as though struggling to hold onto the image. His voice filled the room, warm and familiar, curling around her like an embrace. "You gotta laugh, you know? You have to. Otherwise, the world just gets too damn heavy." The same words from the stereo. The same voice. Elaine stood motionless, breath shallow, her gaze locked onto the screen. Robin smiled. Not at her, at some long-forgotten audience, at a moment frozen in time. But somehow, she felt the weight of his presence. And then, the screen blinked. Not a flicker, not a glitch, a blink. Elaine's stomach tightened. Robin's eyes, bright, familiar, seemed to settle, just for a fraction of a second, directly on hers. The moment passed almost instantly. The screen flickered, the image distorting, the sound cutting in and out. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the television shut off. The room was silent. Elaine exhaled sharply, realizing only then that she had been holding her breath. The house watched, waited, and somewhere, in the unseen corners of the world, A presence lingered smiling, laughing, waiting for something not yet spoken. Elaine stood in the silent living room, her breath unsteady, the afterimage of Robin's face still burning in her mind. The house felt different now, not heavier, not darker, but complete, as if some long-held breath had finally been released. She swallowed, glancing toward the piano. It sat untouched, but she felt that if she pressed a key, someone might answer. Instead, she whispered, "What do you want?" No sound came, no flickering lights, no movement, but she felt it. A warmth not physical, but deep, resonant. A quiet sort of peace. And then, for the first time since the strange happenings had begun, Elaine understood. He wasn't trapped. He wasn't lost. He was visiting. A soul too bright to fade entirely. A presence lingering in the spaces where laughter once lived. Tears welled in her eyes, though she wasn't sad. She smiled, stepping forward, reaching out not to touch, but to acknowledge. "Thank you," she whispered. A soft creak of the floorboard, a flicker of warmth against her skin. And then, the house exhaled. The weight lifted, the presence faded. Robin was gone, but his laughter, his warmth, his spirit would always remain, tucked between the walls, humming softly in the quiet. And the house at last was at peace. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.